Hello, this is Mark Tucker with an APL components video for viewers of the Dabble Lab channel. In this video, we'll learn about events, gestures, and commands. The document link is in the description. So I created this document to go over the different events that are available for the components that we've learned in the course of this video series, and to talk about gestures and also commands. Some of the commands which we have seen also in this video series. So this particular video does not include a link to an APL Ninja project, because we're just going to talk about these and try to understand how events interact with gestures and commands for not only the document but for also components. So let's just kind of look through some of that. You'll notice that you'll see over here on the right hand side: container, edit text, frame, grid sequence, in alphabetical order here, a list of the different components that we've had videos for during this video series. Off to the left, you'll see boxes for base component, actionable, multi-child component, and touchable. These are list the events that are available based on these other groupings. If you remember when we were looking at our base components here and our list of components, that there are these other boxes saying that, you know, base component, actionable, touchable, multi-child. If we were to go to the container, for example, it would tell us here that it was a multi-child and a base component. So any of the properties that were on those, plus any additional properties that are added specifically for that container component. So that's what we're dealing with here. Is as we go through here, we're going to look at some of the different events. Now, what is an event? An event is something that happens, that the user causes to happen, and then each of these events has an array where you can include one or more command objects in JSON format to indicate, you know, something to happen when that event fires. Now that could be something that happens when when the user directly interacts with something. So for example, we could take a text component here and wrap it in a frame and wrap it with a touch wrapper, and that grouping makes a button. And because touch wrapper has this touchable component list of events, nothing directly on any of these have any events, but touch wrapper has this touchable component which has an on press. So when the user touches that button, presses that button, then an event fires, and you can then execute one or more commands based on that. So that's a case of a direct execution of an event. If we look up here at the pager component during our pager lesson, remember you can swipe the page back and forth manually, and as the page changes, then an on-page changed event will happen. But we also used a button that when the on-press event happened in our nav control, then it called a command, a set page command, which then caused the pager's page to change, and the result of that fired the on-page changed event, which allowed us to do something with that. So that's a case where we're not directly causing this event to happen. We're using an event that called a command that then did something to this component which caused this event to fire. The third scenario is an example in this video here where you can specify multiple video sources, and when one video ends, the next video automatically starts to play, and the on-track update event fires when that video changes. Not anything that the user did directly to cause that to happen, just the changing of the video itself caused that. So let's go through and talk about some of these things. Most of these are events, they begin with the word on, and then there are some other things that are close enough to events that I've included them They cause there are things that happen, and then they allow you to call commands. So, for example, actions allow for assistive technology actions. So, like activate, double tap, long press, swipe away, to then run commands. Handle tick allows you to execute something in approximate time intervals, and it's one way to do animation. It's not the best way, but there are cases where you could run an animation based off of handle tick. So every component has an on mount event that fires when the component is first created. When you have a cursor and you cursor into the region where the component goes, then you have an on cursor enter event and then an on cursor exit when it leaves. So that's the base components. Actional components have focus. So when a component gets the focus, that's one of the available states. And every property has certain base properties saying, is the component disabled or has the focus, or is it pressed, or so some of those different states. So one of those is being focused. So when the component gets the focus, there's the on focus, and when it no longer has or is losing the focus, then you can respond to on blur. Handle key down and handle key up have to deal with the keyboard. So pressing keys, like even the shift to control key, whatever, have respond to the key down and key up events. There are no currently events that are off of multi-child component. It's listed here for completeness. And then on the touchable, we talked about on press, which is really made up of an on down and on up, on move and on cancel. So different things that you can do for touchables. There's also this gestures. So on press is kind of a generic event. If you wanted to get into some more specifics on touchables, then you would go into a gesture. And so then you would define under that gestures array double press, long press, swipe away, or tap, which then give you events that then you can attach commands to. So for example, tap is different than on press in the fact that it's expecting a short tap as opposed to potentially a long tap and hold. And it's expecting that your finger, or when you're tapping, or your cursor when you're using that, will the distance that that tap point moves is relatively small, so it doesn't doesn't get confused with a swipe. So that's different gestures that you could use, and you would plug that into this gestures array here, and use it just like you would an event on touchables here. So let's go through some of these things really quick. So document itself isn't a component; it's the root of the whole APL document, and it has its own on mount. So when the document gets created for the first time, on mount will happen. There's also events that fire for configuration change and display state change. Now, if we look at the container component, it doesn't have any events on its own, but it gets all of the events from the base component and any that would be on multi-child component, which there's not any. Edit text similarly has everything from actionable and base, plus it adds on text change, which we saw when we did our lesson on the edit text component. Frame doesn't and text are similar in the fact that they don't have any on their own. Just take everything from base. Grid sequence, scroll view, and sequence are similar. They add an on scroll event, and image and vector are similar in the fact that you get an on load when the image or vector loads successfully, and the on-fail event if it doesn't. Notice that some of these are multi-child components, and remember that is the ability to specify a data property on the parent, on the container or the pager or sequence or good sequence, and then you can define a template as a child property that's going to then get repeated once for every component that's there. Let's see, pager adds on page changed. We have an example of that. We've already talked about touch wrapper, and then most recent video component covers lots of these different events here. So those are all the different events for the components for document and the built-in components. There are things called responsive components, and here are some of the examples of those, and there are events that each of those have, as well as something that's called responsive templates, and they have their own events as well. We're not going to cover those because in the next video we're going to talk about responsive components and responsive templates. So let's go down here to commands. Now all commands share these properties. So type is a required property, it's a string, and that's where you would specify when you're creating your object for your command what type it is. So it could be an animate item type, it could be an auto page type, clear focus. So all of these are different types of commands, and that's a required property. So all commands have description, delay, sequencer, and when, and then they might add their own additional properties depending on what the command is. So if we were to go over here to commands, you can see that there's some standard commands, media commands, and user-defined commands. We'll talk a little bit about that, but just a reminder that there are two different types of commands. Then there could be commands that are normal mode and commands that are fast mode. And if we go down here, we can see it talks about when things are normal mode and when things are fast mode, and it goes through a list of all the different events. So actionable on blur, that runs in fast mode, but handle key down runs in normal mode. And some of them, like on page change, it depends on the situation if it's normal or fast mode. Now, when something is running in fast mode, then some of the commands could be ignored. So if you're running in fast mode, then the idle command is ignored, but the sequential and parallel commands run. And you can make something that would normally be running in fast mode run in normal mode by adding a sequencer. And that's what the sequencer is, and then that allows you to run. So just make sure you take a look at that. And also, all of these commands are listed under the commands. So like here's a whole list of the different commands, and you can look at the details and understand the properties, but it will tell you like if it's required or not. So let's go through this really quickly. So the animate item is going to be what you would use if you want to do animations, and it has an array of properties that get animated, and you can specify an easing. So it's a enum type, so there's specific strings that you would use for the enum for the different easing types here. You can have it repeat. So look at the detail of animate item and any examples that you can find in APL Ninja to help you understand how to create animated items. So auto page and set page both correspond to the pager component and allow you to change the page of the component. So auto page allows you to specify a duration and go through and automatically do like a automated slideshow. It would go through and change the pages of the pager, whereas set page allows you to set the page to a specific page, or relative or absolute. And you can look at the pager component lesson about that. So clear focus, one of the states that all components can have is whether it's been focused or not, and that relates to this on focus, on blur event happening, and the focus property that all the base components have. So clear focus just figures out there's only one thing that could have the focus, and so it just makes the focus, sets the focus defaults. Whereas set focus allows you to specify which component you want to set the focus on. Finish just finishes the APL document, closes it. Once it's hit, then any commands that are after that command doesn't fire. Idle just takes some time. It just kind of waits so much time, and then it and whatever the delay is, and then continues on to the next one. And you could use that if you wanted to have certain timings in a list of commands. Open URL opens up a web browser in APL and navigates to a specific source. And there is an on-fail property where you can specify commands that happen if that page doesn't open. Now, parallel is one of three commands that are like containers for other commands. It's got a commands property, which is an array of commands. The way parallel works is if there's one or more commands, then all of the commands that are the child commands of this parallel command will execute at the same time. Contrast that with the sequential command, which also has an array of commands, but it's going to execute every command in order. First one fires, when it finishes, it moves on to the second one, fires. Now you can have when properties for commands, and they won't fire if the when clause isn't, the data binding expression doesn't evaluate to true, but then it's going to go on to the next command. If for some reason all the commands don't, if the commands don't fire in this array of listed in commands, then the array of commands that you've specified in catch will fire. And then when either of these are done, then those that are in finally. So just think of this as like a try catch finally. Similar, but just running different commands. The next one that's in that category of a container of other commands is select. Select is different in the fact that you can specify a list of commands and when properties, and then the first when property that evaluates to true, it's going to select just that one command to fire. And if it can't find, it goes through everything in the list and one of those doesn't evaluate to true, then it's going to go and fire any of the commands that are in the otherwise property. And remember that the when property, when you don't specify it on a command, automatically defaults to true. So it just assumes it's true. So you'll probably want to have your whens with specific conditions first, and then if it's without, just specify that without a when at the end of that list. So now reinflate causes the document to be rebuilt, the entire document to go through the whole rebuild process. So you can cause that to happen. Scroll to component, and scroll to index have to do with, the documentation specifically says scroll, view, and sequence. I haven't tried it out with grid sequence, but maybe it is all three of them. But it allows you to scroll a page or to a certain place. So like scrolling is a certain fractional portion of the number. So anywhere between 0 and 1 would be a partial page. 1 to 1.9 would be someplace in the second page. So that's the scroll command. Scroll to component allows you to specify an ID for a component, and it will scroll that component into view. Whereas scroll to index, if you think about like a scroll view, you might have multiple text components. Then the first child component would be 0 index, 1 index, 2 index, or if you're doing a multi-child component, something like a sequence, then the first item, the second item, their 0-based index, you can have a specific child scroll into view. One that's used quite a bit, this is for APL to communicate back to the skill itself, is a send event, and you can specify like a button that will send a send event, and then you can handle kind of the equivalent functionality of as if they had executed the voice command. Then we've already talked about sequential, set focus, set page, set value. Oh, well, set state is deprecated. It was a way of setting, specifically just state, but now you'll use the set value instead, and you can set value to a specific property, or it could be, and that's the name of the property, or it could be if you create a bind, create a variable and give it a name, then you can set the value of that bind property, or the bind variable. Using that, you can also, this is used quite a bit. You can, set the text property to a certain value of a specific component, specifying what component you're talking about by specifying the ID property of that component. But let's take a look at this example here. So anything that has this dynamic property set to yes, so accessibility label, yes, checked property, disabled property, display value, change it to one of these enum values. So anything that has dynamic property set to yes is something that you can use, you can change using set value. We have an example of speak item that we used during the pager component, and this allows, when you call speak item and give it a component ID, it's going to use the speech property of that component to say what is in that text there. It also scrolls it into view. Similarly, speak list, like if you have a list of recipe, steps in a recipe, then you can provide use speak list, and it will go through and start at a certain spot for a certain number, like 1 through 3, and it will go through and read you step 1, step 2, step 3. So media commands, we already talked about media commands when we did the video lesson, but setting play media changes the source. So if you wanted to change the source of what video or where you're going to get a video by some other event, then you would use play media. But if you were wanting to change, set a specific, in this case, a command, which is a enumeration for play or pause, there's a whole number of them. You can use control media, and we showed that in the video lesson. So finally, user-defined commands. They're similar to parallel, sequential, and select in the fact that you can specify an array of commands, but this, in the root of the document, there is a commands property, and you can create an object that has as the key the name of the command, and then a list of other commands, and you can use all these other commands that you have available on these these 2 pages here, and build up your own commands. And it could be for a custom property or something that makes sense. Maybe there's 3 or 4 things that you want to have happen, and you want to be able to pass in parameters and then use those parameters to specify what happens with the commands. Then you can use and define your own commands, and then use them just like any other command. You just set the type property to whatever the name of the command is that you specified. So in this episode, we learned about events for document and components, about gestures and commands, both built-in and user-defined. In the next video, we'll have an overview of responsive components and templates. I hope this video was helpful. Please let me know with a like or a share. Thank you for watching.